My name is Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last nearly 30 years I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, reports of UFOs and alien abductions, really scary people, some scary places. You name it, if it's just strange and a little offbeat. I've traveled the globe in search of these weird anomalies, the strange folklore, and the bizarre encounters with the unexplained. But what I learned on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore tonight. Some of the most bizarre legends Wisconsin has to offer. For the next 45 minutes or so, we'll take a tour across the entire state, ending up right back here in town. I'm going to give you the background, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts. I'll talk a bit about some of our research at these places. Heck, I'll even provide you with the directions to these places. But I'm going to leave it up to each and every one of you to travel to these places on your own and determine for yourself whether or not you believe these legends are true. But I should warn you, it's much easier watching these places on television than it is visiting. When you're out in the middle of, people keep coming up behind me all the You know, it's easier on television because when you're out in the middle of these places and you see that shadowy creature lurking from tree to tree, you simply can't turn to another channel and forget all about it. So with that in mind, let's explore some of the weirdest story Wisconsin has. And of course, let's start with some UFOs, unidentified flying objects. It should come as no surprise that we have reports of UFOs in Wisconsin. Because not only do we have the UFO capital of the world here, we have 3 of them. All the towns of Bellevue, Dundee, and Elmwood all claim to be the UFO capital of the entire world. All 3 of them have UFO Day festivals where you can go and celebrate their UFO history. But there's a good reason we have UFO capitals. We have some of the weirdest UFO stories that you might not ever believe. Starting with one of my favorites. This might be the weirdest UFO encounter you'll ever hear about. Happened in 1961 in Eagle River, the small touristy town today. And it happened to this gentleman, Joe Simonton, part-time farmer and a plumber. He was having a late breakfast one day when all of a sudden he looked out his window and he spotted this craft starting to descend into his yard. He claimed it was about 30 feet wide, 12 feet high, and had all these little muffler-type rings on it. Simonton didn't give UFOs much interest prior to this, so he wasn't afraid. He was more curious. So much to his benefit, I have to give him credit, he went out to investigate. And when he went out to the craft, an opening appeared on the craft. He said, like the trunk of your car opening up. And out to the front came the inhabitant, the leader, the pilot, the alien, whatever it was. Simonton could see 2 more inside. They were all identical looking, wearing weird clothing. He said they were very short, dark hair, dark skin, dark eyed. Simonton said they reminded him of small Italian men. They had some sort of jug with them. Without any verbal communication, Simonton realized they needed water. So he goes back to his house, fills the jug with water. When he comes back, he hands it to the leader, and he looks inside, and one of the creatures or things seemed to be cooking something over a flameless type grill. Simonton, trying to get some communication going, motioned with his hand like, "Is that what you're eating? Are you going to eat that?" So the leader went over and traded Simonton for the water, giving him what many newspapers call alien pancakes in exchange for the water. I told you this was going to be a weird case. Simonton ate one of these pancakes, said it was the worst tasting pancake he'd ever had. Said, no wonder they're so small. This is what they're eating. Then The craft shut its door. He said he couldn't even see the seam, and it started to fly off. Meanwhile, people around the area were calling in about their own sighting of a UFO around Simonton's farm. Simonton watched the craft go up into the sky, and then it tore off. He didn't report it, but word leaked out in the small town. And as you can imagine, once word got out, Simonton was overrun with people at his farm. In the first week alone, over 1,000 people showed up looking for those UFO pancakes. Simonton wished he never would have reported it. He lost out on a lot of business because people thought he was too crazy, and that the government showed up, Project Blue Book, with Dr. J. Allen Hynek investigating it as well. They thought he was sincere, but they thought he was stir-crazy, living out in a farm by himself, that he was daydreaming about a saucer landing in the back of his yard. But Simonton's not the only one to report strange things. And in fact, when I mention haunted places in Wisconsin, a lot of people think of cemeteries. The reason being is quite simple. Back when cemeteries were chosen, the land was thought to serve as a portal between our world and the spirit world. So when your loved ones passed on, it would just be easier for them to travel from our world to whatever world you believe they go to. Regardless of whether or not you believe this theory, there are many places in our state where it seems to be working in reverse. The living are not moving to the dead, but the dead are coming into our world. Not too far away in Oconomowoc is one of those cemeteries, LaBelle Cemetery. Many people go here specifically to see this monument. It was said that when this woman was alive, she died while drowning in a nearby Fowler Lake. And now when you go to her gravesite, all sorts of weird activity will transpire. People claim to see blood oozing out of the eyes as though they're tears. Others say the hands will turn black right before your eyes. But my favorite part is the dare. People daring one another to do things at these locations. And the dare here is that when you go there, if you're very quiet or hide behind a gravestone, you might see the statue actually come to life and move. Many people, welcome. Many people that I've spoken with claim that when they saw it, she walked right down to the lake and then vanished when she got to the lake. But when they looked back, she was right back in her original location. When they turned around to see the Fowler Lake, no one was there. Others claim that she moves about the cemetery, especially at night. And you can go there for your own experience. Also, please stay on the cemetery grounds. Don't go into Fowler Lake, because the legend is that there's a giant sea monster living in the lake as well. But if you're one of those who likes to dip your toes in some sea serpent waters, you don't have to go to Oconomowoc. In fact, you don't have to go anywhere. You can stay right here. Lake Michigan is filled with stories of giant leviathan of the deep inhabiting the waters. Some of the earliest pioneers reported encountering these monsters while in the water. The stories continue through the decades. If you ever are bored, dig through the old newspaper archives. You'll find dozens and dozens of stories of people seeing something in the lake. One of my favorites happened back in 1900. Construction workers were building near the shoreline. They had their horse and long carriage with them. When they took a break down by the water, they saw a giant monster coming toward them. They immediately ran back to the construction site, grabbed all the tools they could. They wanted them as weapons because they didn't think any of their friends or family would believe they had just encountered a sea serpent. They were going to kill this thing. But as soon as they got back, the thing simply descended into the lake and vanished from their sight. Skeptics claimed that they had seen nothing more than a school of fish running about, swimming, and darting back and forth. Others claimed it was a sea lion escaped from the circus. Now what's What's interesting is Adam Forepaugh had been in the area prior to that, but he said he wasn't missing any of his animals. If you ever hear stories of monsters in the old days, the number one explanation given is an escaped circus animal. I don't know how these circuses survived because they were losing all of their animals every single day. But that's the explanation. But even to this very day, I get reports of people seeing something in the lake that they simply cannot identify. But maybe the lake's too big. Maybe you want to stay a little bit closer to land. For that, I recommend you head to the Mississippi River. Actually, I recommend you don't go here. Because in the 1800s, early 1900s, people were terrified of the river. They didn't want to go there because there were giant river monsters inhabiting the waters. If you believe the newspapers, these things were 9 feet long, covered in a thick scale-like armor that a bullet could not even pierce. And then in the early 1900s, parents refused to allow their children down to the water. Not as a cautionary tale against drowning, but because they believed there were man-eating fish in the river. What was happening, mostly men, were drowning. And when they pulled their bodies out, they found a lot of them had these weird scratch marks or claw marks on their calves and ankles, as though something grabbed them, pulled them out, and drowned them. But then the newspaper said, "Don't worry, we've solved this case. It's okay, go back to the Mississippi River. It's nothing more than a couple alligator gars swimming around." Well, this is all well and good when you don't know what a garfish looks like. But when you see that this is an alligator gar, it's a little different story. Because if a 10-foot gar swims against you, you're going to think it's a sea monster. And in fact, it is. It's just one that we happen to know about. But if you follow the Mississippi River up north a little bit, you'll eventually come to Lake Pepin, a lake on the Mississippi River dividing Wisconsin and Minnesota. They believe something bigger and more deadly than an alligator gar is living in their lake. Tales tell that the first native peoples would only take their strongest and sturdiest canoes out on the water, because every time they capsized, they blamed it on this monster. When the seaboat captains came up on the steamboats, they too reported seeing these giant monsters, these aquatic beasts. Newspapers started reporting them. We have accounts in the newspapers going back to the Civil War talking about this monster. This one was somewhere between the size of an elephant and a rhinoceros. Over the years, so many people saw this thing that they dubbed it Peppy, the lake monster of Lake Pepin. But don't let these cutesy postcards and t-shirts fool you. Many believe it was a monster. Not only have people seen it, some believe they've captured photographic evidence of it. A man contacted me a few years back. He was out fishing on the lake when he saw what appeared to be a log moving upstream against the current. Thought it was odd, so they motored over there. When they got there, they realized it wasn't a log at all. Snapped a photo of what he thought showed a long-necked, hump-like creature, much like you might consider the Loch Ness Monster. I've been on numerous expeditions to Lake Pepin, most recently living on a houseboat for many days and nights with noted researcher Noah Voss. As you can see, we had underwater cameras, we had sonar, we had fishing equipment, nets. We even jumped in using ourselves as bait, but luckily or unluckily, Peppy did not make an appearance. The best part about this story is that the people of Lake City, Minnesota are so convinced that Peppy is real, or at least convinced you'll come looking for it, they are now offering a $50,000 reward for the capture of this monster. As of today, nobody has collected the reward. The weather we're having this year, you could get there this weekend, capture Peppy and be back $50,000 the richer. Or stay in town at your own haunted building here as well, the original Racine College. Lots of ghost stories around the DeCoven Center here, mainly from the founder, who did pass away while staying there, Many see his spirit, thinking maybe it's somebody dressed up as a tour guide or period costume. They walk by only to have him vanish right before their eyes. Of course, a lot of weddings happen there. People contact me about seeing weird things while celebrating their big day as well. Recently, the center has been doing ghost walks in the October season to give you a little chance to get closer to some of these spirits. Today, by far, the most popular cryptid out there is that of Bigfoot, known throughout the world as Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Yowie, the Sasquatch, the Abominable Snowman. Most people think of these things in the heavily forested western states. They don't often think of here in the Midwest. But every year I receive dozens of reports of people who have seen something they can't explain. This is the small town of Steinthal, Wisconsin. Today there's not much there. You've probably never heard of it. It's almost an abandoned ghost town. But back in the 1960s and 70s, this was the hotbed of activity in Wisconsin as far as the paranormal was concerned. Mostly teenagers and young college-age students would head out to this abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Still there today, owned by a doctor from Chicago, but they would go out there, and because they believed the house was haunted, they'd go out there and see lights moving about from window to window. They'd hear voices of people inside, but when they went in, no one could be found. But as more and more people ventured out there, another legend began to grow. Thanks in part because the house was surrounded by swampy marshland, which you can kind of see here in the grainy newspaper photo of it. It was here that people started seeing a Bigfoot-like creature. About the same size of a Bigfoot, 7 to 8 feet tall, estimated around 300 to 500 pounds, except this thing had glowing green eyes. And when I say green eyes, I mean green eyes. 3 of them, according to witnesses. They had no idea what to call this thing, so they called it the Thing. So many people saw it that people started going to the Steinthal Tavern, which sat right where this religious chapel is now. People would sit out on the front porch of the tavern, looking across the street where my colleague Kevin Nelson is, because that's where the Steinthal monster had been spotted. But today there are no stories of the Steinthal Thing. Talking to the few local residents who remain, there are no modern sightings, where did this thing go? Was it ever there? Is it still there? Seems weird that it would be the hotbed of hundreds of sightings and then literally dried up overnight. But a 3-eyed, green-eyed monster is not the weirdest story in Wisconsin. That might come from the fact of a vampire. As you heard earlier, I spent time in Romania looking for vampire legends. Little did I know I should have stayed in Wisconsin. Mineral Point, that is. See, back in the 1980s, Mineral Point was overrun with vampires. It all began when this police officer, John Pepper, was patrolling late at night. He passed by the Graceland Cemetery here when he saw what he reported to be a very tall, very pale, very thin, very ugly vampire, complete with a cape. He chased this vampire to the edge of the cemetery where he said it easily flew over the fence and disappeared into the night. He did not want to make the report because he knew how it sounded. A vampire in Wisconsin, but he was on duty, so he made the report, and sure enough, the very next day, media from all over the world descended upon Mineral Point looking for that vampire. It got to be so much, Officer Pepper quit the police force, moved out of town, and refused to talk about the case ever again. As soon as the story broke, people started calling in saying vampires were jumping out of every nook and cranny in Mineral Point. Now, I don't know if the police chief of the time believed it or not. Maybe he was having fun with the semantics, because he told the newspaper that he was offering his officers overtime to stake out the place, but none of them would bite on his offer. Even to this very day, people claim there are vampires in Mineral Point and at the Graceland Cemetery. I've been at the Graceland Cemetery day, night, all seasons. I've never seen the vampire. But then again, I bring my vampire hunting kit with me just in case the vampire is still there. Or maybe a little bit weirder, you can head to the Devil's Punch Bowl in Menominee, a sacred area. For decades, people have claimed to see weird balls of light similar to these floating through the area, changing in size, shape, and color. I spoke with a group of teenagers that were parked in the lot here, debating whether they should go into the punch bowl. They said that a ball of light started approaching their vehicle and actually entered inside their vehicle. So I asked them, I said, what did you do when this ball of light came into your car? And they all looked at me as though I was crazy. They said, we got out of the car. But if you do get out, go down to the punch bowl itself. Here is a beautiful location. All sorts of paranormal activity is said to happen here. People hear disembodied voices. They see apparitions. There's a legend that if you take water from the stream, it will remain cold regardless of whatever you do to it. But that's not the best story. The best story came from a woman who was hiking with her son. She told me they were leaving, walking up the steps to go home, when she decided to take one last look at the beautiful waterfall that was there. And when she looked back, she noticed there was something there staring back at her. Something that couldn't be there. Something that shouldn't be there. But yet, there it was. What did this woman report seeing? Well, maybe I better let you just take a look. This creature! She said it was straight out of folklore. 3.5 feet tall, pointed ears, pointed cap. What you might call a gnome, a fairy, a sprite, a goblin, a troll, the little people, the hidden folk, the good ones, on and on and on. She immediately grabbed her son and said, hey, do you see this thing? And by the time the son spun around, the thing had either run into the woods or disappeared from sight. She was embarrassed about reporting it. She didn't want to, but she put it out there in case other people had had similar experiences. And she was right. I spoke with a UW Scout football player who was taking his girlfriend down to the punch bowl during October to really scare her, to get her into the mood for Halloween. They made it about halfway down the steps here when they heard a growl from some creature they thought was a little gnome being. His plan worked, except it wasn't the girlfriend who got scared. He ended up running back to the parking lot. I spoke with the young woman who told me she sat there for another 15 minutes waiting for maybe the creature to make another noise or to make an appearance, but then she felt bad and had to go rescue her boyfriend. Even if you go here and you don't see ghosts, you don't see little people, you'll have a wonderful time. This is a beautiful area. You'll have a great expedition into the wilds of Wisconsin while looking for the little people. Or maybe you want to stay in the safety of your own vehicle. Is anyone here from Stevens Point? No? Good. You won't have to worry about avoiding this place. It's called Highway 66, except the locals, they don't call it that. They call this place Bloody Bride Bridge. Reason being is that many years ago, a young woman was coming home on her wedding night. She was involved in a car accident on this bridge, and she bled to death waiting for help to arrive. As soon as that story spread, unsuspecting motorists driving over the road reported seeing what appeared to be a woman dressed in a bloody bridal gown. When they tried to figure out who she might be, she vanished right before their eyes. It was said that the first witness was a police officer who, while driving at night, reported that out of nowhere, a bride appeared in front of him, slammed on his brakes, closed his eyes, and braced for impact. As soon as he came to a screeching halt, he got out to see the damage, the roadkill, if you will. only to find no one was there. He scoured the area but couldn't find any person. He was convinced he had run over the vanishing bride of Bloody Bride Bridge. But my favorite part is the dare. The dare tells that if you're brave enough or foolish enough to park your car on the bridge, when you look into your back mirror, not only will you see the bloody bride, but many witnesses told me she was actually sitting right in their back seat. Luckily for me, the dozen or so times I've waited, she has not appeared. But maybe for you. But heed my advice. If you're going to take this dare, be very careful. This is a very busy road today. I would hate to have to put you in my next program as another casualty of Bloody Bride Bridge. So the idea of a vanishing hitchhiker is one of the most ubiquitous urban legends throughout America. But this next case, we may have an actual identity for the vanishing hitchhiker. This is one of the first cases I ever investigated nearly 30 years ago. A case I'm still working on today. Right outside of my hometown of Eau Claire is a place called Elk Lake. This is Elk Lake Dam. I first received a report from two men. That's a call from the dead, let me know. Don't worry, there's nothing to see on this photo. But I first got a report from two men who were sitting here one night just enjoying the beautiful nature of the area. When all of a sudden one of them turned around, and right here he noticed what appeared to be a glowing woman in white standing behind him. So he nudged his buddy and said, "Hey, do you know there's a glowing woman right behind us?" His buddy said, "Yes, but I'm too afraid to turn around." About a half hour went by, they finally got the collective courage to turn around. The woman was gone. So were the two men. They hightailed it out of there. One of them was so afraid he would not bring us back to the location. The other one did. At the time, I was a UW Stout student studying psychology. One of the cohorts in my program was a young man named Aaron. He believed he was psychic. He could pick up on these things. So I brought him out, and while we were there, we wanted to take a photograph of one another where the two men would have been sitting that evening. But you can see here, Aaron's camera malfunctioned. It was working earlier, it worked later, but it would not take the photo. My camera did. Didn't notice anything with the naked eye, but when the film came back, this is back when people actually used film, we noticed a weird mist or fog right where the two men saw that woman in white. So I started talking about this case. After a program, a man came up to me and said, "I lived out there in the 1970s. There was a murder, but that's all I can tell you, that's all I remember." So I started flipping through the newspaper archives, and sure enough, 1974, I realized he was right. There was a murder out there. A young woman was killed. But not just any nameless, faceless young woman. It was this young woman. Her name was Mary. She was hitchhiking from Minneapolis to Chicago. Last seen being picked up on the side of the road by this gentleman. This gentleman was last seen kicking dirt and leaves on the side of the road in this very rural neighborhood. So they called the police. By the time the police got there, the man had escaped, and the body of young Mary was on the ground. She had been stabbed to death. And even though they had a witness description of the suspect, he was never captured and the case went unsolved. So I decided to go back to this place. If it was haunted, maybe it was haunted by this young woman. So I brought Aaron the psychic with me again. He wanted me to take a photo of this pillar, which I did. I took dozens that evening. The only thing out of the ordinary was this weird mist or fog on one of the photos. But as we were about to leave, Aaron believed that the spirit of this young woman was going to follow us back to campus. So we decided to take one last photograph, and I'll let you decide whether she was following us back, because when the film was developed, this is what came back on the film. Now, of course, people have seen shapes and all sorts of faces and the like, but the good news about this is that so many people have heard about this case, so many media outlets have covered it, that the Dunn County Sheriff's Department recently reopened the case into the murder, even going so far as to dig up Mary's body looking for DNA evidence, which they did not unfortunately find. I didn't know you could write an entire book about this place, from phantom hitchhikers, a woman, to people committing suicide on the bridge, to a serial killer, father and son, who lived right on the hill here, burying their victims in their swampy backyard. So an entire place is just filled with creepiness when you go there. And speaking of creepiness, this is the most common question I receive from people. Where can I go to spend the night in a haunted place? Well, if you have that macabre sense of adventure, you're in luck, because in Wisconsin, we have all sorts of haunted lodgings. Hotels, motels, B&Bs, resorts, campgrounds. You can take your pick. One of my favorites, or least favorite, depending on your outlook, is right down the road in Milwaukee. It's the historic Ambassador Hotel. Now today, this is an upscale, wonderful place to spend the night. You'll love it. It's really a high-end place. A lot of fun staying there. But back in the 1980s, this place was a cesspool. They rented rooms out to drug dealers and prostitutes, criminals and pimps, and even the occasional serial killer would spend the night at the Ambassador. Of course, this is the Milwaukee cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer stayed at the Ambassador on many locations, on nights. On one particular night back in the 80s, unfortunately, he went out drinking and picked this young victim up from a bar. Brought him back to his hotel room where they spent the night drinking. Next morning, Dahmer awoke and found the poor victim dead. Dahmer claimed he had no recollection as to what happened. So instead of going to the police explaining the accident, Dahmer went out and bought the biggest trunk he could find, came back and chopped that poor man up and put him in the trunk, disposing of him at his grandmother's house, Dahmer's. Ever since that moment, people believe the hotel has been cursed. People claim that when they're staying there, they'll be walking by and they'll see the ghostly image of a man covered in blood walking through the hallway. But when he vanishes into a wall, they think maybe it wasn't a real person. Others have called down to the front desk complaining that there's a fight in the hallway or next room to them, only to have staff come up and find nobody's there. Others claim to have seen Dahmer himself walking through, his spirit walking through the lobby. When I first went there many, many years ago, they didn't want to talk about the Dahmer history. Not because it was gruesome, which it is, and they didn't want it tied to them, but because they didn't know much about it. The place had been renovated so many times and changed hands so many times. The old records don't indicate which room Dahmer spent the night in. When you're renting the room out to criminals and drug dealers, record keeping's probably not the best of your talents. So a lot of people actually go there because of the haunted history. Of course, those who play the Brewers end up staying at the Pfister Hotel, which they're afraid because that's haunted by Mr. Pfister as well. So no matter where they stay, they're going to get spooked in Milwaukee. Every place has one of those roads you want to avoid. You do not want to go there. And if you go to New London, you'll have one such road.
Stop calling. Stop calling.
No problem. So, New London, you have one place people avoid at all costs. And it's called Marsh Road.
I got your prescription.
Simply enough, because it's surrounded by marshland all around it. There's all sorts of activity on this road, including people who believe the road is alive. And what I mean by that is they'll drive one way down the road and claim it's a certain distance. But when they drive back, it'll either be shorter or longer, as though the road is morphing and growing. Others have all sorts of electrical disturbances on this road with their vehicles. Batteries die out, they have to be towed out of the area or junked. New automobiles will malfunction while they're there. But the stories go back many decades, including the next one that goes back at least until the 1950s. Perhaps it even predates that, but that's as far as I've tracked it back. And it talks about a homecoming king and queen who went out to the road to celebrate their becoming royalty. During October, during homecoming week, they went out to celebrate on Marsh Road. But their celebration was a death pact. In fact, they took their lives at the end of ropes out on the road. And now the legend claims that if you go out to the road, especially during homecoming week, you will see the ghostly images of that homecoming king and queen hanging from the trees. But don't worry, the story gets even more bizarre than this. Because dating back to the same 1950s period, people have talked about a different creature inhabiting the marshland. A creature that you've probably never seen before. A creature that seems straight out of a B horror movie in Hollywood. Because this creature is dubbed the Goat Man. Part goat, part human. Which part depends on who you talk to, whether it's the top half or the bottom half. Many people claim to have seen this hideous monstrosity walking about, tracking through the marsh. Even if you don't believe in ghosts or goat men, I have to tell you it's pretty creepy there at night by yourself. If you're walking down the street here at midnight, it's hard not to have every little twig breaking, your mind conjuring up images of the goat man. Some say it was actually the goat man that killed those young children, and that it was covered up because they did not want to ensue fear throughout the area. So whether the goat man killed them or they committed suicide, the hard part about the suicide is it wasn't covered in any media reports at all. You would think if two popular high school students committed suicide, somebody would have wrote a piece about it in the newspaper, but nothing as we can find. Sometimes these places have a ton of phenomena all happening in one little area. This is outside of a place called Mary Dean, a small island that back in the 1800s an entire town lived out on the island. It was named after a young girl by the name of Mary Dean, who was said to have drowned or died on a steamboat, and she was buried in an unmarked grave on the island. At one time, an entire town lived there. They had a post office and businesses. The only way to get back and forth was through the local ferry. Many claim that the spirit of this young woman still haunts the river where she met her watery end. Those who see her claim that she'll act like a siren, trying to entice you out to help her, saying things like, "Help me, save me, I can't swim, I'm drowning, please don't leave me." Legend is, if you're foolish enough to take the siren's bait, she'll pull you under and you'll meet your watery grave and spend eternity with the ghost of Mary Dean. I talked to several people whose family members have died when they drowned in this area. Every year, a few people seem to drown here. And when I contact their friends and family, they told me the person was drawn there, as though by some unseen force, like they just had to go there. The best part is you can camp on the island. You don't need to register, you don't need to pay, you can just camp out there. Those who do report seeing the ghost of Mary Dean late at night coming through their camp area. But the story gets even better, because the legend tells that if you pull your car into the parking lot by the boat landing of Mary Dean, you might encounter what many people are calling the hellhounds of Mary Dean. If you're not familiar with hellhound legends, they've been reported throughout the world in many cultures. Often they're thought to do the devil's bidding, that they are a harbinger of death. They're large black dogs, usually with glowing red eyes. Very sinister creatures. They seem to be inhabiting this area as well. After a program I did in Stevens Point, a big burly biker guy came up to me. You know, the type of guy you wouldn't think would get spooked by anything. He told me him and his buddies took their motorcycles out to see the ghost of Mary Dean. They had never heard the hellhound legend. But as soon as they got there, he said they were surrounded by hellhounds. When I asked him why he thought they were hellhounds and not just wild black dogs, he said 3 things stood out. 1, they were nearly transparent. He could almost see right through them. 2, they had glowing red eyes. Not eye shine, not a reflection. He said it looked like embers from hell were emanating from their eyes. And 3, no matter how fast they went on their motorcycles, these things kept up with them. He told me it wasn't until he went to kick one and his big biker boot went right through it that they finally disappeared. They were so spooked they didn't stop driving until they hit the safety of a nearby town about 30 miles away. But devil dogs and hellhounds are one thing. But thanks to my good friend and colleague Linda Godfrey, Wisconsin is now known as the werewolf capital of the world. It all began when Linda was working as a journalist, not far from here in Elkhorn. She started receiving reports of people traveling down a small stretch of road called Bray Road. There, usually at night, but not always, people would report seeing, for a lack of a better term, what they called a werewolf. Said it was the size of a bear, but shaped more like a wolf, with the long muzzle and the deep, dark, matted down fur, huge claws and fangs. And they said it was a biped, running upright on its hind legs like you and I do. Others would see it on the side of the road, eating freshly killed prey or roadkill. Once Linda's books came out, we started receiving reports all over from America of people seeing a very similar werewolf-type beast roaming through the wilds. Most popular right now is the Michigan Dogman that has a lot of similarities to the beast of Bray Road. And if you ever travel down Bray Road, you'll see a lot of people stopping to take photos on this relatively short road. But I want you to keep in mind tonight that not all monsters in Wisconsin look like this. Because some monsters in our state, those monsters are even scarier than this. Because some monsters in Wisconsin, well, those monsters look a little bit more like this. Everyone had supper already? Okay. Some of the younger legend trippers might want to close their ears. I'll skim over some of this. If you don't recognize this gentleman, this is Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, Wisconsin. If you don't recall Ed's story back in the 1950s, you might recall some of the movies they based on his life, including Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, many, many others. Most people just recall Ed as a killer. And true he was. He killed 2 people that we know of, probably half a dozen more, including his own brother. But before he was captured in Plainfield, Ed was well-liked. Odd, but well-liked. He would babysit for kids, and he brought his neighbors over what he called a venison stew for them to eat. One neighbor told me he remembered his mother getting this stew from Ed. It had such a horrible smell she threw it away. Which is great, because even though Ed was a murderer, his real passion was to wait until it got dark. Then for nearly a decade, he would fire up his car or his truck and head out to the nearby cemeteries, where he would dig up the remains of women that reminded him of his own deceased mother. He would bring them back to his farmhouse, where he lived in squalor. Here's a detective sitting in his home. I'm not going to get into the details of what Ed did in his home. Let's just say he used the material for lampshades and furniture and the like. He had skulls everywhere. When Ed really got a bug in his system, he would make an entire outfit of this material. And he would wear it like a demented Halloween costume as he danced under the front yard, the moonlight in his yard. But when we finally caught Gein and discovered how truly evil his crimes were, they wanted to open his house as a museum of horrors that you could go and pay to see. But before they were able to do so, it mysteriously burned to the ground. Townsfolk torched it, allegedly. The entire thing burned to a crisp, gone. But even though the buildings are gone, and Gein is no longer among the living, many believe he was so evil he has forever cursed Plainfield. And maybe they're right, because there's a lot of places tied to Ed that are thought to be haunted in Plainfield, including the cemeteries where he took his victims from. Many will walk out there and see what appears to be a man digging a grave by hand. When they approach, he simply vanishes right before their eyes. Others will go out and see Gein himself at his family memorial plot. Gein is buried here, but his gravestone is no longer there. People kept stealing it as a gruesome souvenir, so they got rid of it. But you can see people will leave trinkets and coins behind while visiting. Others claim that the old hardware store where Gein killed Mrs. Warden is haunted. And for many years, up until very recently, it was a hardware store, continued operating. There, staff members told me that they'd be working and they'd see things fly off the wall on their own. They'd put something down and find it in a new place. Oftentimes, they see the ghostly image of a woman walking through the store. Others claim they could hear the sound of a hunting rifle going off, even though no gun was ever found going off. Gein killed Mrs. Warden with a hunting rifle as well. But now the store has moved to a new, bigger location down the road. Last time I was there, the building was for sale. If you're looking to own a piece of Wisconsin's grisly history, you might want to pick it up. But by far, the most common place people go in Plainfield is the Gein estate. As you saw, the buildings are no longer there, but the farmland is still there. People think it's cursed. In fact, the first time I showed up, I had two women who believed they were intuitive, psychics. They had no idea where we were. They thought we were in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, which is where Plainfield is. But as soon as I pulled over and said, let's check this place out, they refused to get out of the car because they were picking up on too much negative energy. Others go out here and hear the sound of women screaming, thinking it's one of Gein's victims. They look around, nobody can be found. Others claim to have seen Gein or his brother's spirit walking around their old farmland. But if you're going to go here, I recommend you do so not on Halloween. Most likely you'd get a trespassing ticket rather than a paranormal experience. But as I'm running low on time this evening, I'm going to end on a type of case that you have not heard me speak about this evening, because it's a private home, and a lot of people who live in a house that is thought to be haunted, they don't want it to be known that their house is haunted. But I put this up last for two main reasons. One is because it's the most common report I receive. Out of all the reports I get, the overwhelming majority are from people who believe their house is haunted. Some believe they know who's haunting it. They smell Grandma's perfume or Grandpa's cigar on the anniversary of their death. Others have no idea who or what may be haunting it. Some, believe it or not, are okay with it. They become accustomed to the activity. Others would rather leave as soon as they can. They report very similar things: mysterious rapping and knockings on doors and windows, electrical disturbances, odd smells, apparitions, all kinds of just weird things going in their home. Placing objects down, they'll disappear for months on end, only appearing in the most obvious of places. But as you heard, the first reason was because I get so many of these. The second reason is that this is one I hope you take with you tonight. Because when all of you go home after the program, put your head down on your pillows to go to bed, and you hear the wind rustling outside your window, I want you to ask yourself, is it possible, just maybe, that wasn't the wind howling outside your window? And maybe you too are living in a haunted house as well. So with that, I wanted to save the last 10 minutes or so that we have for any questions, comments, or stories from any of you. If you want more information, my website has more than you could ever want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here at the library. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of Wisconsin. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen, you'll meet some weird people, and along the way you might just discover that the strangest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions, comments, or stories. Otherwise, you let me off the hook way too easy tonight. Let me see if I can get the lights up.